in the 1960s, you had many teacher organizations. The two dominant were the San Francisco Federation of Teachers and the San Francisco Classroom Teachers Association. But you had groups like the Teachers Association of San Francisco that had a significant membership. That all of those organizations used to pretty much vie to get people to join them. And they would do things like put on little lunches or have meetings during the first couple of days of school when you had, usually you're doing something at the school, and then in the afternoon they would put on something. So you basically had a choice of which of the organizations you wanted to join. CTA had, in my mind, sort of a stodgy reputation. They had come out of the leadership of the schools, and they were, at least at the time I came along, they were still dominated by school principals and administrators. So if you're going to be an active teacher and relate to teachers, the only real choice was the San Francisco Federation of Teachers, and that's what I joined. I had a friend in elementary school who explained why she became a member of the AFT. It's because she went to a CTA meeting at a home, people just in her school, elementary school. And as they organized the meeting, they said that since she was a nice young lady, she could be the one who served tea. And that sort of characterized what the CTA approach was at that time. Whereas the AFT was involved in political action, was ingrained in labor and what was going on with labor, so it was a much different orientation. I was fairly vocal, and Jim Ballard took me aside at one time and said, you know, instead of just sort of picking at things, why don't you get involved in things? At that point, the organization of the San Francisco Federation of Teachers, you had elected members of the executive board, and the president also appointed 4. So he appointed me to one of those positions as a coordinator of communications or something like that. And that gave me a position on the executive board. Jim was I think a major factor in most of us who came up over the next 20 or so years in the union. Jim had come out of doing organizing and working in, I believe, in the auto workers. He was a veteran of World War II, came into teaching, was an elementary teacher. He came on as a staff person working for the union. And then after, I think, a year or two as staff, he ran for president and was elected president. Well, that was controversial that he had been staff and then ran for elected office to start with. And his form of leadership was to look at what was happening in the country and to try to take the best of that and introduce it here. So when New York went on strike and formed what is now Local 2, in New York, he saw that as something that we should be doing here. You should be standing up and fighting for yourself. So when I was student teaching in 1968, that was the first strike. That was the one-day strike. And that was the strike where Joe Alioto was mayor and was very involved in it. And the story that Jim used to like to tell was that the mayor and the Board of Education came and said, we don't have to negotiate with you. It's not in the law. And then after the one-day strike, and turned out a lot of people, the same folks came back and said, there's nothing that says we can't negotiate with you. There's nothing against it in the law. And so there was a negotiation, and there was a commitment to hire more teachers, to start developing a program of real affirmative action within the teaching corps, and there were raises and everything else involved. Under the Wagner Act, you had public employees who were organized. So, but you also had some who were excluded, and teachers had been excluded at that point. So that became a matter of state interpretation. And so it's the Roda Act of 1977, I believe, that gave the right to organize and the right to form a union in California. that had been taken up and tried in Sacramento for several years, and just the year before, George Moscone had carried that, and it narrowly lost in committee, didn't actually get out of committee. We were there for the committee vote and all that, and I think it was, I don't know, something like 6-4 or something, and did not get out of committee. Roda was able to put it together and get it done. Raoul Teilhet was the California Federation of Teachers president, and he was the one who promoted it. Raoul had gone and always had an undying belief that the teachers should be united, and actually paid for and revived each year ownership of the name, the United Teachers of California. And it never came about, but he owned the name in case they ever found a way to merge. So that battle was going on. We were consistently going to Sacramento, testifying on the need and the reason why you needed collective bargaining, and how teachers should not be excluded from collective bargaining. When the Roda Act came along, it allowed teachers. It did not extend to paraprofessionals at that time. So that's why there was a continual battle to establish the principle, get the law, then expand the law to involve paraprofessionals also.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so collective bargaining comes in 1977. What does the rollout of collective bargaining look like? Like, how does it, because this is a new process.
Well, from the Federation, we undertook to try to educate people on what it was and what it wasn't. And we had leaflets and flyers, we called meetings, we went over and talked to people about, this is what you'll be able to do under collective bargaining, this is the responsibilities you'll have as a result of collective bargaining. So we conducted an educational campaign around that.
So what did it look like? So can you explain how collective bargaining worked? And I mean, it's coming on at the same time as massive defunding is happening in California, Prop 13.
It's actually coming just before that. So the Proposition 13 may have been in the minds of the folks who brought it up, but that wasn't forefront in people's minds at that time. You had a system where you had very good funding in California. You had the Educational Masterplan, which had sort of kept everything moving along and made UC as great as it was, the whole system. You had the system of state colleges and the incredible system of community colleges. And so this was a state that seriously invested in education, seriously believed that education was important. In fact, it's written into our state constitution. So the feeling now that teachers are going to be participating in the direction of education, it was a euphoric feeling. It was a grand feeling. And then it was a question of how much, what are you going to do? What are you going to actually be able to negotiate? And what are you going to be able to achieve? Tenure was essentially established by Kate Kennedy and her work in the schools. And that was
in California, so not just San Francisco. Because I know she was
in California.
She was part of the Knights of. She was associated with the Knights of Labor. Is that correct?
Well, she was a member of the Knights of Labor, but the Knights of Labor did not have an organized teachers organization. So, Kate Kennedy is sometimes referred to as the first union teacher. But the Knights of Labor had assemblies, and anybody could join the assembly. And it's clear and obvious that Kate Kennedy was a member of the Knights of Labor, but that wasn't actually a union to deal with an employer at that time. It was more of a like-minded assembly of people and all that. So in 1874, Kate Kennedy established equal pay for equal work. She had moved from being a teacher to being a principal teacher, which was at that time just the lead teacher essentially in the school. And she was teaching in a grammar school. So San Francisco had grammar and primary schools. And she was being paid as a primary teacher, which is where most of the women were. She said, no, I'm a grammar school principal, that's where I should be. She worked and got that got legislation demanding equal pay for equal work for women who did the same work as men at the same grade and the same level. So the San Francisco School District responded by making sure that women were all in the primary grades, men were in the upper grades, and so they maintained the wage disparity by doing that.
Yeah.
Then she ran for state superintendent on the Labor Party ticket. Didn't win. Women didn't have the vote.
This is around what year?
This was 1886. She didn't win, but her boss was running, the superintendent of San Francisco schools was running on the Democratic ticket. And as a San Franciscan, she took enough votes away from him that he lost. She went on leave right after the election, came back, and they changed her school. And they moved her from a grammar school to a primary school. They moved her from a school right in the center of town out to Ocean View, which was 4 miles, which was a significant difference in those pre-car days. And so she worked through the courts on that one. It took 3 years. And that essentially established tenure. It said that you could not change the position that a person was in. You could not remove, because they subsequently fired her, you could not fire a person in the absence of cause. So basically it established just cause, which is really what tenure is all about.
So after that, but then tenure, my foggy understanding is it was then in the 1920s. So after World War I, there was kind of a period of, obviously, of union activity that was then the 20s, or kind of backlash against union, and against the 30s. You have the new labor developing.
Yeah.
But was tenure, was it further kind of entrenched in the 1920s? I think I may have read that somewhere.
You may have read that, but it was established in 1886.
So any public school teacher after Kate Kennedy, you had
to have a hearing, you had to have cause, it had to be basic, your firing had to be tied to your performance of your work.
So do you think Kate Kennedy should be commemorated in the pantheon of women union activists? What was her national impact on, or at least regional?
It's funny because in some of the papers
I think Margaret Healy and these other is a formative, Chicago Federation of Teachers founder.
Kate Kennedy was a very determined woman, and in her papers there was an obituary the year after she died that said that Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton came to her classroom to congratulate her on the work she had done. I personally cannot find any record of that other than the reference in the obituary, and then 30 years later a family member retold that story. I'm not sure that actually happened, but Kate Kennedy should be remembered and should be honored as a labor leader and as a very, very significant leader of women's rights.
All right, so back to the 1970s. So we've kind of covered the initial push towards collective bargaining. There are these strikes in 1971 and 1874. Can you describe those? Do you remember what the cause and of those disputes?
I have not been thinking about those, and I really don't have anything at hand to talk about those. They were obviously early organizing efforts, and all they.
How would you organize a strike if you have multiple unions effectively representing your membership or teachers?
You'll find that for the most part in those strikes, you did not have CTA participation. Actually in 74 we did. CTA, after the strike was going on for a while, they voted to join it. 74 was also the big city strike, and so there were shutdowns all around town of all kinds of services, and CTA eventually joined that. But 71 they did not get involved. 68 they did not get involved.
Mm-hmm. And then we touched on this a little bit, but the formation of the Paraprofessional chapter in 1972. So there was a chapter of, how did that work organizationally? They were a chapter within the local, or were they part of the local at that time?
They were.
How were they incorporated?
They were never incorporated separately. They were incorporated as part of the local. And when we eventually merged with the NEA, that became a little difficult for the NEA to kind of figure out and handle. So they became like a division within the local. And the woman who was significant for that was Linda Cook. And I don't know if you've seen the little booklet that we put together on paraprofessionals in their union. I'll have to try to find a copy for you. It's very, Linda Cook had come from New York, where she had done this work, and came out here and realized she had absolutely no contract, nothing. She talked about how she was responsible for not only getting the lunches for administrators and things, but also I think she had to do darning or mending or something like that. Just anything that they wanted, it could be required of them. And so Linda got involved and was the first real leader of the organization of paraprofessionals. And Jim Ballard brought her along and encouraged that. When I was president of the union and we put together the booklet I'm referring to, Linda didn't want to talk about it. She said it was such a terrible time. You know, the abuses were so terrible that she just did not want to go back and remember it. It took a little reminding her of how she had changed all of that and made it different for other people. Took a little bit of that discussion before she was really willing to come around and do it.
And there's always been, it's even with the kind of observing union politics now, UESF politics now, there is still a divide, between the paraprofessionals and teachers. Was there a sense at that time of hey, these teachers think they're better than us, or there's also a racial divide? Yeah. Oftentimes, many of the paraprofessionals.
But I think it goes to the two theories of organization. The AFL, originated by organizing a craft or a trade, whereas the CIO developed
industrial unionism. Yeah.
Everybody in the building, should belong to the union. The organization of paraprofessionals is clearly more along the line of the CIO. You're all working together. Now, had I my druthers, the AFT would represent the clerks and the bus drivers also. Clerks, cooks, custodians, the folks that are represented.
Security guards are.
Security guards are,
yeah.
But clerks, cooks, and custodians are in SEIU. The accountants are in another local. No, they're not an active ASME in San Francisco, but professional technical engineers. That's where they are, and so there's no reason why all of those shouldn't be brought together, except that different unions have carved out different pieces of turf and all that. So, I lean more towards the CIO.
Okay. And then we kind of talked about that, the AFT, which I guess I can ask now, just about the national, kind of the interface between the local and the national. Most people don't understand kind of how that works and how, and in fact, most of your dues go to the big organizations. So what was the national kind of AFT scene like? We have Albert Shanker coming in 1972. What was Local 61's relationship?
Shanker was elected president in 1974.
In 74, okay.
At the convention in Toronto.
And so what were these conventions like? If you could just describe, in general, the relationship between the local and the national, and then what that was like in the 70s, and kind of what the main goals of the national organization were at that time.
Well, '71 when I first experienced a convention. The convention was in San Francisco, so there were a number of us who were able to go to it. And it was the first time I got to meet Al Shanker and many of the folks who were involved. We just were looking at pictures that some of us have from the 70s, and Joel Panzer had taken pictures at that convention, and he has Roy Wilkins, who was speaking to the crowd, and Joe Alioto was there, and Shanker, and just a whole series of portraits. And he caught my wife and myself as we were registering at the registration desk, which just sort of surprised me.
In the AFT's, history documentary they have, there's a picture of you at one of those conventions. So
there are pictures of me at a number of the conventions, but 71 was my first convention, and then 2016, I guess, was my last. So
paint a picture of this convention. What were the topics? How's it organized? What's it look like?
In the American Federation of Teachers is literally a federation of local unions. Each local union maintains its autonomy, but also is then tied to the larger union. So as the San Francisco Federation of Teachers, you would pay per capita dues to the national, and that would then give you a certain number of seats at a convention. Most of the conventions at that time were in the East, and so as San Francisco, we would not send a full delegation there. We would tend to send no more than 10 people at any time. But in 1971, when it came out here, we had, 25 or 30 delegates. We had quite a few delegates because it was close at hand. And it gave us the opportunity to see how some of the other folks operated. This was a time when we took a bus over to San Quentin to protest what was going on with Angela Davis and all of that. And also it was a time where there was a debate over Vietnam and what the position would be on Vietnam. And what New York, which is the largest state, has the largest number of votes, New York was committed to supporting the Vietnam War, not opposing it. And so what Shanker arranged was to have a vote that essentially freed the New York delegation. And so the New York delegation was freed, folks voted as they wished, and there you saw no longer did you see a full support of the legislation of the Vietnam War. It was the beginning of making a difference. We got to meet Shanker as an individual. He came to us. Everybody out here said he talks like a New Yorker. He has that New Yorker talk. He demonstrated for us how he talked as a kid and how he had learned to speak more common English and all that. And he spoke in his...
Where's he from? What part of New York?
I don't know what part
Brooklyn,
of it. Maybe,
Bronx.
Yeah, I don't honestly know. But he had made an effort to speak differently. He had been a junior high teacher and a math teacher, and he suffered the same kind of things that the rest of us did prior to collective bargaining. I remember having an evaluator come by and say that it was going to affect my evaluation because he could not see into my classroom from the hallway because the shade on the door was up too high. Mm-hmm. My concern was that I had an administrator who was too short to see into my classroom. He didn't quite see it that way. Well, Shanker had similar kind of events going on in his teaching life, and that's sort of what drove him into organizing and into the union. But he was incredibly impressive. He was so bright. He was so articulate. He not only knew both sides of an argument, but he knew what the good points were that needed to be included from his opposition and all that. He was an incredible man.
Where did he stand on the Vietnam War?
He engineered the vote to allow the New York delegations to vote their conscience and not be bound. So he did not, I don't believe he took a personal stance, but he allowed the organization to move away from support for the Vietnam War.
Uh-huh. And why did this come up? Was there a resolution around it?
There were, well,
because it clearly
in the 1970s,
yeah.
yes, I mean, Vietnam War was a dominant.
So, but it was just a resolution of opposition, essentially, that was proposed.
I believe it was. I don't recall it exactly.
And that opened up a series of debates, I'm sure. Okay. And so, how else would you characterize, if Shanker's vision of the AFT and of education in general? What would you say are the main kind of policy goals that he had as a leader?
I think what you saw from Shanker was sort of a traditional union viewpoint, that the workers know what the work is, and you must involve the workers in making decisions about the work. And he did all kinds of things to try to bring that about. He tried different structures and he suggested different things. I mean, the whole idea of charter schools came originally from Shanker. He said you should have a place where teachers can experiment and they are not constrained by all the policies of the district. He wanted those to be within the framework of the public schools, not the way they have gone sort of askew now, but he wanted that kind of involvement of teachers to make the determination, not only to determine for that moment, but then to be a demonstration for others to bring out the best that teachers could be.
Mm-hmm. And getting back to the idea of this connection between the local and the national organization, so how do you characterize the relationship between the locals? So obviously they collect dues. They set the dues on a per capita basis, and
the dues are set in convention. So both the state and national dues are set in conventions, and so I've been to conventions where those things have been debated and those amounts that have been proposed have been altered and all that. So it's not just some they that's beyond there that does it. It's actually the delegates who get to go in there and make the changes and make it happen. So there is that financial relationship. Then there is the relationship of the national in terms of being located in Washington at the seat of power, then being the people who articulate political goals and political plans. Also try to demonstrate educational leadership, where since the time of Jimmy Carter we've had a Department of Education, and prior to that health, education, and welfare, where you try to have an effect on what the national policies are and how the nation is funding the schools also. So from the local, you send money to the national to ask the national to try to have that influence on your behalf.
And what percentage of dues go to CFT or AFT?
I don't remember all those breakdowns, but I know that in California, CFT ended up getting more dues from San Francisco than from Los Angeles. That we ended up being the primary funder of the California Federation of Teachers. This
is back in the 70s.
This is when I was president in the 2000s. Wow.
Well, isn't that partly based on the model of the merger that happened here, as opposed to the one? So we have joint membership in San Francisco as teachers. In Los Angeles, you opt.
We're skipping ahead to 1989 now. Actually, Los Angeles changed that, and so Los Angeles has now accepted the San Francisco model, basically. Okay. And we got that model from a local in Minnesota, actually. So, but in 1989, what we were able to do was convince the state and the national that we should be able to merge, and it shouldn't cost us any more than it was costing us now. So essentially, to get twice as many members, the state and national were allowing us to pay essentially half per capita. At the time of that election, there were 1,700 San Francisco Federation of Teachers members. There were 1,400 CTA members, and so that's 3,000, and there's 1,000 people out there who just didn't belong to anything.
Mm-hmm. And now it's grown to 6,000.
Well, 6,000 includes paraprofessionals. I was just talking about the teacher side of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe before we get on,
yeah, but that's much further down your road.
Can you just close up a little bit on the role of the AF, staying in the 70s for just a little bit longer? Any other words on Shanker? Any personal experiences you had with him or with the national leadership? Any other kind of during that time?
The structure that would elect the vice presidents and president within the AFT is the Progressive Caucus. And I became an officer of the Progressive Caucus in 1974, which is the same year that Shanker became president of the AFT. Then in the early 90s, I moved up to chair that, and I did that for a decade also. So I had that role. Then when I became president of the Federation in San Francisco, I ran for a national vice president position, and I maintained that for about a decade also.
The national vice president
of the AFT.
Of the AFT. Oh, okay. You were the vice president of the AFT from.
I was one of 40 vice presidents of the AFT. No.
Okay. And in this caucus you're talking about, that this is like similar to the PLC now? It's a caucus within
it's a caucus within the national organization.
Okay. And what are the other caucuses?
Other caucuses sort of came and went from time to time. Caucuses in the AFT go back into the 30s actually, and there were communist organizations and non-communist organizations, and they shared power in some ways. Sometimes one had the newspaper and the other had the presidency and things like that. But the Progressive Caucus is the one that has endured and is the one that still is there and still has been successful in electing the president and most of the vice presidents.
So Randy Weingarten she's a member of that caucus?
Yes, she's a member of the Progressive Caucus.
Okay. And what are the kind of main ideas of this organizing principles of the caucus?
There is a whole platform. There is a whole thing. I mean, I don't have all of that in.
Well, not specifics, but just in general.
I mean, they're interested in maintaining the importance of the individual member in the work that they do, in guaranteeing that there's a diversity of membership and all that. I mean, it's all the good things that you would want it to do. And, you know, that. I always thought it was significant that when the integration of the schools came about and needed to be reflected in the organizations, the AFT doesn't control its locals. So it told its locals, you have to be integrated or you can't be in the union. And as a result, lost all kinds of locals through the South.
This is going back to Brown v. Board.
Yeah, it's going back to the 50s. The NEA could make that kind of statement, and so what they did is they diversified the organization by merging with an all-black teachers organization. So that merged the top without really affecting the locals. And just an interesting difference about how you do things.
And then just on that, on the topic of desegregation, busing must have been something that the AFT had to nationally kind of think about at this time, right?
You know,
Boston
yeah, Boston was very difficult, but I really was not involved in that.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of a
Yeah.
local issue. Okay. And then let's talk a little bit about the CFT, the development of the CFT during this time. So, what were these conventions like? Who ran the CFT during the 70s, and do you have any recollections of statewide,
Well,
the state federation?
Raoul Teilhet was the president of the CFT from the time that I got involved up to 1985. And so he was the figure, one of the most articulate men I had ever met. He was, I think, a very principled person. He personally did not like Shanker and did not agree with Shanker politically. He did not agree with Shanker around New York support for the Vietnam War. And if you listen to the tapes of that Fred has of Raoul talking about Shanker, he basically thinks he was responsible for everything short of acid rain up here. I think that hurt California in terms of national involvement in politics. I remember seeing Raoul standing outside of a Progressive Caucus meeting and just sort of looking in. And that to me was very emblematic of what the CFT was like in terms of national politics for a long time.
And it was just more progressive? He was more leftist, or is that a fair characterization? Or?
I don't know that it's entirely fair as a characterization, but it certainly would be a perception. Raoul was an absolutely wonderful man, and he did not agree with Shanker. And a lot of it, I think, came down to being personal also. It was principled. I mean, when New York was in support of the Vietnam War, California was not. I mean, that was a distinction for sure. But San Francisco, on the other hand, was more involved with the national than the CFT was.
And who did you side on, the Vietnam War, Al or Raoul?
I loved them both.
But on the Vietnam issue, where did you?
Oh, we were opposed to
Vietnam
involvement. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to kind of lump Prop 13 into the 1980s questions that I have. Any young teacher or middle-aged teacher now, and because all of the teachers who went through the 79 strike now are pretty, for the most part, they've retired. There's a few people still around there, but I don't know if you know Rosemary Kamkar. She's a special education teacher at Lincoln High School.
Yeah, I know Rosemary.
She started at Lincoln when she was 22 and just recently retired, and is a beloved teacher there. She just talks about how when she started her first year, it was right the year after the strike had happened. So surprisingly, she's hired right at this time. All these budget cuts. But she basically said in the lunchroom there was just a deep divide among the faculties. So can you just give the background of this strike, Prop 13, how it came about, how the union responded to it? What are the causes and effects of this strike?
Well, 1978, the Howard Jarvis folks passed Proposition 13. And what it did was took all funding of the schools away from the local community and dumped it on the state. And nobody knew how it was going to work out. San Francisco School Board didn't know what kind of money they were going to have or what to do about it. And so what they did is they sent out layoff notices to just about everybody, and made them stick for people who had up to 10 years of seniority. So if you had 10 years of seniority, you were not guaranteed, you were technically laid off, and then you were offered to come back. And you could come back, there was a whole list of the conditions, And the last one was that you were subject to being released at any time by notification of the Human Resources Department. Well, Henny, my wife, and I went down, so we were very early there to be in line to get this, and we took it back to the union and explained that, you know, you've basically lost basic employment rights if you sign back up. There were 1,000 of us who were in that condition, and that became very much the basis of the strike that went down in '79. It was a 6-week strike. We had always struck in April or something like that, and it was always a question about whether or not you're going to close up the year or how it was going to end. We had no idea what it would be like striking at the beginning of the year, so that was a large question. And what we found was kids just didn't come to school. You know, for the most part, they just, you know, there was about half attendance in the school. They weren't out roaming the streets. They stayed home. And we had, with the strike, we had daily rallies. We did a lot of them out in Marks Meadow. We did a lot of them out at the Irish Cultural Center, trying to keep people together. And at the end of it, it was such a sort of disastrous ending that people were allowed to vote on whether or not to end the strike who were not necessarily the people who'd been out on strike. And of course, not everybody could stay out the entire 6 weeks. It was very difficult. And so it was not a happy conclusion. And then the school district started rolling people back into the school on a different basis. They'd open different schools and all that. I was at Washington High at that time. The first day of the strike, the principal of Alamo Park came by and pointed to me as I was picketing and said, "I got you, Kelly, I got you." We found out what they'd done is they'd taken all the teachers that they expected to be on strike and they'd put them in a pool. They'd then fed them out and reassigned them to other schools. That was non-contractual. I mean, that's the kind of thing that you had on that list of things. If you were going to reaccept employment, this is the kind of thing that you were subject to. So at the end of that strike, which, as I say, was not a successful or glorious experience, I spent 6 weeks, I think, at Alamo Park, and during that time they were trying to adjust and get everybody back to their original schools, and they went through a grading period or so in order to do that. So it was a very difficult time, and once you start losing things like pay, you start being concerned about the people who are helping you lose that. So there was a lot of animosity between AFT and CTA at that time. No other organizations were any longer really around. Once it came down to collective bargaining, it was just the San Francisco Federation and the San Francisco Classroom
Even
Teachers.
split at this point?
Pardon me?
Was it roughly an even split?
I think that the San
If
Francisco
they won decertification.
I think San Francisco Federation had more people at that time, but I'm not positive. I don't know the exact numbers. The first contract was a 1-year contract. So once you have every time you have a contract opening, you have the ability for another organization to challenge. CTA refused to challenge at the end of that first year because the layoffs and all that were coming, and it would be a terrible time to take over. After the strike, that's when they challenged. And they won by, my recollection is they won by about 600 votes. They had a 2-year contract.
This is 1980 or 81?
So then, picking up at the end of 79, 80,
okay.
And 80, 81. Then in 81, I think they had about 300 votes they won by. And in 83, they won by fewer. And it finally came down in 89 that the San Francisco Federation won again. And we did something that when the San Francisco Federation lost, one of the things you lose is the right to dues deduction. And so the city charter has certain slots that have the right to deduct. One of the slots was the Bay Area Educators Credit Union, which was the Teachers Union Credit Union, the SFFT Credit Union. What we did, and I remember Jim Ballard and the national staff, Chuck Richards and I were the ones who had the discussion, is we went out and signed up all of our members that we could to be members of the credit union.
Parnassus, right?
The credit union followed basically wherever the union was. At this time, it was actually located on Church Street with the local, or 14th Street, 14th and Church, and so you paid your dues through the credit union. The deduction went to the credit union, then directly to the union, and we were able to maintain membership. We also maintained visibility within the district by being the bargaining agent or the representative of the paraprofessionals at that time. And you had things like, I was very active by then at McAteer with the closure of McAteer as because of the asbestos in the building, and so that was all guided through AFT, and so AFT continued to project an image of being very active, very involved in what was
even
going
though
on,
you lost
even though
your
you're
bargaining.
not the bargaining agent. CTA did something also that ended up not being good for them, and that is they did not pay to have their officers released. The district didn't charge them for that, and so that became then an issue later on.
So they're out of job. They're out of a salary, paycheck, when they lost their certification.
So when they lost, when they were decertified, they didn't have the way of using the credit union they didn't have the organizers to go out and do that kind of work, and of course they were going to lose the pay for the officers. Their membership plummeted to something in like 300 or so.
That was kind of the checkmate.
And it became in their interest to go ahead and merge, because the state CTA could have put in the money and run an organization in San Francisco, but it would have just taken tons and tons of money, and you would have always perhaps had the same sort of split. So the CTA agreed to a merger, and the merger occurred so that the president of the Federation was the president of CTA was the vice president, treasurer of the Federation was the treasurer, secretary of the CTA was the secretary. So,
it's kind of like, sounds like Lebanon's kind of, right?
Sort of
one Maronite Christian, one Shiite.
Yeah.
And but going back before we get back into the merger, so the strike, again, how do you organize this strike with two different organizations? What was the NEA affiliates' role in the strike? How did you organize? Did you have conversations among the leaderships? What did that look like, the strike organization?
Well,
prior to this, in the summer of 1979.
The strike organization was, again, primarily within the one unit. So it was primarily the AFT that was organizing what was going on.
And did CTA members, did some of them go out on strike?
Some of them
did. Or is
did.
it pretty much just correlated that those members kind of stayed at work and...
A lot of them stayed at work. And when Rosemary talks about how the way things were, when you went back into that building, there were people who just would not talk to one another again. They were just forever in 79.
And they kept their jobs, right?
Oh, yeah.
So they kept their position, they went to work.
Yeah. I mean, but you had some CTA members who were in that 1,000 that were laid off that the strike was about. They were very torn. But you had...
Because they could be scabs, essentially.
Well, remember that, yeah, they could be. But you had the 1,000 people who were returned to work, but under restricted conditions and could be laid off at any moment for any reason. That included both Federation and CTA people. They're both kinds in that group. When we went on strike, it was primarily the Federation that was leading the strike, because CTA, at some leadership level, decided to lay in the bushes and see what happened to AFT, see if they're going to challenge. Had that been a strike where everything closed down immediately and there was a huge victory, CTA would not have challenged. But because it was such a difficult, prolonged, and disastrous strike, they then felt emboldened to challenge again, and that's what started their...
And they probably made some promises during that process.
I'm sure.
That they're going to fix everything.
Yeah.
So, what is it?
They blamed Jim Ballard for being strike happy, to the point that when in 1984, when Joan-Marie Shelley came on as president, the next representation election, they still blamed Jim Ballard, even though he was out of power at that
kind
point.
of like Obama or Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
Is still blamed by
George Soros.
The MAGA crowd. Yeah. Okay, so you're running a strike in San Francisco. I'm just trying to wrap my head around this. You say that most of the kids stay home, but some kids come to school. How do you structure a school under a prolonged strike setting?
Well, if you're on my side of it, you don't structure a school. But we had, for example, the principal down at Lafayette, during the first week of the strike, he would meet 4 or 5 of his teachers off campus. They would park their cars, and then he would drive them in and walk them through the picket line. I know that because I was up at Washington as a teacher and picketing up there at that time, and the people came to me and said, this is what he's doing, why is he involved in it? So I went down there the next day and I said to the principal, this isn't your strike. You can't do this. You're going to have to bring people together at the end of this. You can't do this. And he stopped doing it. They probably the same people came in anyway, but they had to come in on their own. They had to make their own decisions. We had the school district was offering whatever was a lot of money at that time to people to come in and scab. So we organized ourselves up at Washington, and at the end of the day when they came out, 2 of us would follow them. One would be in a car, the other one would be on foot. And a man, Patrick Chu, Patrick became an administrator at Galileo eventually. Patrick and I followed this one guy who came down from Fairfield. And he walked all around the Richmond district to avoid going to his car. Well, we knew where his car was. We knew where he was parked. We'd seen these guys before. And so he ended up going up to the gas station here on Geary and pretending he was going to get on a bus. I yelled out to Patrick, I said, just follow him. I'll follow the bus. I was in the car. We'll be there. So the guy stopped, got off the bus. He called the police. He said we were harassing him. Police car came up, and I said, I live in this neighborhood. This is my friend Patrick. I've been showing my friend Patrick around the neighborhood. And the cop just looked at me and he said, leave him alone, would you? Would you just leave him alone? I said, not doing anything, officer. Now remember, we knew where he was parked. Cops took him to return him to his car. We went around, so we were sitting there facing him when he came back to his car. Never saw him again. So there was that kind of stuff.
Nice. Sounds like a union thriller there.
Yeah. Thriller.
Yeah. Well, no vigilantes. That's the one good thing. You didn't have to face armed crowds of...
Somebody from the school district
What was there any violence? Or
somebody from the school district came and flattened all 4 of my tires, and my car sat
wow.
in front of the house in the driveway. It was interesting because my house is being used as the strike headquarters for Washington. And
This house here?
Yeah. There's a little plaque in the front room
Nice.
that they gave. I knew the car was low. You went out at 6 o'clock to put the kids in the car to get them off to childcare. And the key, the lock was down there. It was all the tires are flat.
Who do you think did it?
I'm pretty sure I know who did it, but I don't want to. I don't even know if he's still alive.
Was it a district employee?
Oh yeah, it was a guy at Washington.
A teacher or an
Oh
administrator?
yeah, teacher.
Teacher.
Pretty
so
sure.
It's
Yeah.
a CTA member.
Yeah.
Yeah, SFTA. Wow. So, are there any things you look back on? And what was your role in the union?
I was on the executive board. I was called on to organize pickets to go to board members' houses.
So you're an e-board. You're just an general e-board member. You were not in the 70s. You were not a vice president, or you weren't in leadership yet.
Was I secretary of the local? No, I became secretary of the local.
So looking back on that strike, are there any things? What are your what was your takeaway? Because, I mean, this is fast forwarding ahead to your presidency in the 21st century, but a lot of people are calling, we need to strike, and you've had this experience of leading a strike and kind of seeing what it what it entails. What are your takeaways from having been involved in the strike? Were there anything you would have done differently, or how did it shape your kind of view of collective bargaining in general?
Well, I think strike is a weapon that you don't use lightly, and I think that's part of a problem now, is that people think that it's something you can just do and it's all over. Some of these folks, like the UPD folks right now, do a 3-day strike. To me, that's not a strike. Strike means that the situation has gotten so bad that you are not going to put up with it anymore. You're going to withhold your services until things are changed. And if you say it's going to be a 1-day strike or a 3-day strike, that's an inconvenience. That's not a real strike. So it convinced me of that you go in to any kind of strike intending to win. I mean, you're not going in there just to box in the ring. This is a grudge match. I mean, this is for all the marbles. So I take strikes very, very seriously, and it's very hard to convince people who haven't had that experience quite how serious they are. Because people know strikes through TV, or they know of them through a 1-day strike in
Steinbeck novel.
Yeah, or something like that. And but they are very serious.
But what about that? Because I was, as an UPD member, we did a 3-day strike, and you could make the argument that having a short strike, as opposed to a prolonged kind of battle, is more of like a PR campaign. So, like, say, if for example, right now in San Francisco, there's a lot of appreciation, or people generally support teachers. So if we were to have a short 1-day strike, keep kids home, send a message to involve the community a little bit and say, hey, this is an important issue. For example, supporting teacher housing.
I think
couldn't you have a short strike that's effective along those lines?
I think you touched on it with your initial comment that it's a PR strategy. A short strike is a PR strategy. If you can't make your point any other way but doing that, that's a PR step, and do that. It's not really what a strike is. Strike is withholding your labor until you can get what you want. And by announcing in advance that it's a 1-day strike, you've kind of lost that leverage anyway.
Okay.
The hotel workers are on a strike right now. UPD had a 3-day demonstration.
How do you think? So the Marriott workers. How do you think? What's your take on that? How do you think that's gonna go? Do you think they have enough leverage to get what they want?
Working with multinational corporations, they have an incredible challenge. And they have gotten so smart that they now no longer localize what they're doing. So I know that when there were strikes in San Francisco, conventions and meetings fled down to San Jose. So you notice that this is in San Francisco and San Jose and Oakland. And by moving it out to Boston and to Hawaii and other places, they're sending a message that, you know, that that the workers are all together on this. These are conditions that affect all of the workers in all of the places and have to be respected by that employer. But the employer is so huge that you really have to do it on that basis.
Cool. All right. So middle of the 80s here, and then I think we can. What are we at here? Just for time. So we're at about an hour and 30 minutes. Maybe we could just take it up to the merger, and then we could even possibly start if we do another interview. Start at that point with the merger, and then just
up to you. Just remember, I'm just retired. I just sit here.
Yeah. You're getting paid. I'm on sabbatical too, but I've got to pick my daughters up at about it's getting close to the timer. I don't want to push it too close. So you mentioned Jim Ballard. So he's leading the organization at this time, and there's a little bit because he's had to oversee that strike. He lost some of his support. So could you talk about kind of the end of his tenure and handing over power to Shelley?
So Jim was clearly the leader of the San Francisco local, and Dave Clisham was the staff member. Dave had been a counselor at Mission, and after the strikes and all that, he went back and worked on his law degree, and Dave is...
His wife, Pam Clisham, was the principal here.
Yeah, and Pam was on the executive board of the union and actually was the hostess of a union television show that we did for a while.
Oh, cool.
And I think she still has the tapes of it. So Dave was sort of second in command to what was going on. And so they got us through the 79 strike. And that forever branded Jim as strike happy in people's minds. Jim had been president at a time when all kinds of stars aligned to allow for collective bargaining, to allow for this kind of activity by individuals, by seeing the rise of militancy among teachers and all that from basically coast to coast. Excuse me. The Los Angeles teachers were on their, whatever it was, 80-day strike or something in 1989. Strikes were endemic throughout the country as people tried to establish the rights of teachers and stabilize that. Of course, once all of that was pretty well established, you see nowadays you very seldom see teacher strikes. And the places that you do see them, they have welled up largely on a state basis in states where they have not had collective bargaining or they have not had any kind of real leadership in that area.
And so Joan-Marie Shelley, she takes over.
Joan-Marie Shelley had been Jim's vice president for 4 or so years, and Joan was revered not only for her sort of ladylike demeanor and all that, but her basic heartfelt commitment to union movement and what was going on. 1971, her father, who had been the bakery wagon drivers and the head of the labor council,
Teamsters even tried to challenge Jim Hoffa, I think.
he had been also one of the few people who voted in the state legislature against the Japanese internment. And I know that Joan-Marie celebrated that every year with him when it came around to the day of the recollection of that vote. Anyway, then he'd been our congressman for a while and then our mayor. And Jack Shelley came out of retirement, actually came to the Labor Council to swear us in the night that Joan-Marie Shelley became a Labor Council delegate. And Jim Ballard had tried to say to us, this is not a teachers' meeting you're coming to. This is the Labor Council. Some of the language will be rough. Some of the, And Joan said, my father couldn't be more proud of me if I had been elected President of the United States. And it was really, I thought, a very touching and significant moment. Now, in fact, the Constitution and bylaws of the Labor Council at that time carried language saying that it was a responsibility of the Sergeant-at-Arms to remove drunks from the floor. And we subsequently changed that to something about maintaining order, so you didn't have that reference to drunks. But there was a period of time when the San Francisco Labor Council was a fairly rowdy body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so that the AFT started sending. She was one of the first delegates of the AFT to the Labor Council, or had they already been?
No,
how long had they?
We'd had delegates for quite a while. This was 1971. Happened to be the time when Joan-Marie and Henny and I and several others was our first election to the Labor Council.
Okay, and then this is. So then she.
And by the way, Henny and I are still on the Labor Council. We have been since 1971.
Oh, nice. Yeah, how does that work? How does the relationship between UESF and Local 61? What is the relationship with the Labor Council? We have delegates on it.
Part of the San Francisco, part of the American Federation of Teachers says that a local, to be aligned with the American Federation of Teachers, also has to be aligned with your local labor council. So you pay per capita to the local labor council also, and there's a whole formula there for how many delegates you get to the labor council, and so San Francisco participates through that.
Mm-hmm. There's a monthly meeting where UESF is.
There are usually 2 meetings a month. Susan Sullivan now is on the executive board of the Labor Council. I was during my time.
Uh-huh. And how does that help? What are the benefits to our union?
Well, if you're going to do anything in San Francisco of a labor nature, this gives you access to 80 other unions who know about it at the time and can help and can participate. It also gives you the Secretary-Treasurer of the Labor Council who can speak on your behalf and speak for all those other labor unions. So when we were talking earlier about Local 2 and their strike, last Saturday they had people from everywhere. California Federation of Teachers was having a meeting of the paraprofessionals down the peninsula. They put them on a bus and they brought whatever it was, 50, 60 people up. Well, that's something that you do as a solidarity with the other unions, and you know the other unions through the Labor Council.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, and maybe let's end right here, but has to do with kind of developing during the 1980s, the paraprofessional career program, and then just kind of how the relationship between paraprofessionals and the Local 61 develops at this time.
Okay.
So yeah, how did this paraprofessional career program?
Did you want to talk about that next, or
we'll talk about that now. Just finish. Okay. That's the last piece.
Well, I'd like to get you the little pamphlet we have on paraprofessionals, and I'm sure that I have at least one copy around here somewhere. Paraprofessionals, again, under the industrial organization model, were a next obvious place for the organizing. CTA did not organize paraprofessionals and was not involved in that, and in CTA locals, for the most part, paraprofessionals and other non-credentialed employees are ordinarily organized through SEIU or AFSCME. In San Francisco Federation of Teachers chose to take that on and chose to organize the paraprofessionals. As I mentioned, Linda Cook was involved in that initially. The whole purpose, you had a lot of paraprofessionals in the schools in the late 60s as a result of federal education. There were federal education rulings and money. And so it became a real difficulty to try to balance the budgets and who they were working for and who was really paying them and all that kind of stuff. But it's pretty well in hand now. Paraprofessionals perform an invaluable job in the classroom. And I don't say that just because my son's a paraprofessional. I say that because I worked with paraprofessionals also, and I know what they can do and what they can do to really support what goes on in a classroom. So the whole idea of trying to elevate their status through collective bargaining has been ongoing, and it is something that is not necessarily well respected by the general public, because they don't see the role of the paraprofessionals or para-educators, as they're sometimes called, or classroom aides, as they're sometimes called. They don't necessarily understand how vital that role is in making connections with individual children, of being there to create a situation where a teacher can work with a smaller group by having them work with another group and all that. So it's something that was very close to my heart, as during the time that I was president, we tried to raise the pay scale and get more recognition for paraprofessionals.
And the paraprofessional career program was that's lit now. I guess it's called the Para to Teacher program, but there's funding that helps paraprofessionals get their bachelor's degree that develops at this time in the 1880s. Right?
I don't know to what degree it still exists, but it's something that came about as a what was called a trust agreement. And I don't know if you know Julie Coppock at all, but Julie had worked for the San Francisco Federation of Teachers before she got her PhD and went into educational consulting business. But Julie was very much involved in that, and it happened during the time that Joan-Marie was president. And the trust agreement was pretty much outside collective bargaining. It was an area where you're going to work together on something with the administration. And the whole goal there was to create exactly what you're talking about, that whole system of bringing paras in, giving them credits, supporting them, getting them through a degree program, and then into the schools and on to becoming teachers. I found that the district, with that and with the teacher residency program, there were difficulties because of the way the district would handle the individuals and whether they would place them and how they would go about doing all of that. So I don't know that the commitment continued as it should have, but I thought it was a very noble effort.
All right, so it's now 2:15. I think we're gonna stop for today.
Sounds fine.
And let me just make sure I do this correctly so we don't lose anything. I'm gonna hit the record button. So it is November 9th, a little after noon, on a very smoky day in San Francisco. All the kids are forced to stay inside. So here we are. It is right also after Election Day. So this last Tuesday, we had a big midterm election. And if I could just kind of start with that, we had a big superintendent race, which is very unusual to have an expensive competitive superintendent's race. But if you could just talk about that specific one, what your feelings are about that, what it represents for the union, and first of all, and then also kind of what power does a superintendent have? Because most of us don't really know exactly what a superintendent of state superintendent of education does.
All right. State Superintendent of Public Education has really become it was a position that John Swett ran for back in 1860s. He said because it's the only position that a person not a lawyer could hold, and John Swett had been a teacher in San Francisco, so he ran for that. And so it has traditionally been an educational leader who's been involved in it. When I first came into teaching, we had Max Rafferty, who was an extraordinarily conservative, right-wing person in charge of education, and he did everything he could, he said, to deliberalize education. He was surprisingly beaten by Wilson Riles, who then served for 3 terms for 12 years as superintendent, and he was then unseated by a former San Francisco 3rd grade teacher by the name of Bill Honig, who actually had moved on to become a superintendent in a small district in Marin. So there's been a lot of contention about state superintendent for quite a while, but never until this year has it gotten to a point where it's as expensive as the race has been this year. Part of that really goes back to the previous year when you had Marshall Tuck running as the white knight of the charter schools. So he had all the charter school money flowing to him. When he first ran against Tom Torlakson in Torlakson's second term. Torlakson's father, by the way, was a principal in San Francisco.
Which school?
He was principal at Hoover and then at Washington. I knew him at Washington. And then this second time that Tuck ran, the charter school folks really loaded money into his campaign and into the dark money side of the campaign. And so he was confronted by Tony Thurmond, who had been on the school board over in West Contra Costa County, which has been a very troubled district for a long time. And Tony, came in well after the destruction of that district by a superintendent by the name of Walter Marks. He did what he could in the district, and he then moved on to fill an open assembly seat for 2 terms. And so Tony Thurmond had always seemed to be a very good person. He served on the West Contra Costa School Board with Elaine Merriweather, who was one of the officers of UESF, and she had been on the board for a couple of terms also. The actual result is in doubt at this time. There are about 1 million votes that are out there still to be counted, and Tuck is leading by about 71,000. So while it's generally true that the later ballots that are being counted later have traditionally run Democratic, we don't know what that means since both Tuck and Thurmond are Democrats. Thurmond an active member of the party and participant, and Tuck using that as a label. So we still have to wait to see how that's going to turn out.
Okay. And what exactly does a state superintendent, what powers does he or she have?
Well, the Republicans went and attacked the position essentially and stripped most of the powers out of the position. So there's not a lot of direct effect that the state superintendent has anymore. He directs the policy direction of the schools in California. So when you have things like a statewide test, he's in charge of selecting and implementing a statewide test, things like that. But in terms of the day-to-day activity, we have about 1,000 school districts in California, and they are autonomous, and so they make their own decisions about how things are going to be done.
Okay. So, and on top of that, what is your? It seems like the charter school movement is gaining ground. You have in San Francisco Innovate Schools, which is an organization. I'm not sure exactly who it's funded by, but these kind of more conservative think tanks, you have Doris Fisher, the wife of the Gap, the founder of Gap, and then Reed Hastings, the founder of Netflix, kind of funding all these various initiatives to push charter schools. San Francisco has been pretty effective at repelling these, but could you talk a little bit about charter school expansions and your knowledge, historical knowledge of how charters came to San Francisco and what the future is?
Charter schools have been an idea that was created by Al Shanker originally as a place where teachers could innovate and would be free of major restrictions in their setting. And so they were intended as laboratories for innovation. The people who supported the idea of vouchers then got hold of charter schools and started converting their activities into charter schools. They essentially take school district buildings and the funding for school district students, and they take it away from the school district in order to run their schools. San Francisco has not had a lot of charter schools. We do have charter schools, and we do have charter schools that are good charter schools that do serve as those kinds of laboratories and are actually represented by UESF.
What would be an example of those?
The Sheriff's Five Key Schools, which brings high school education to incarcerated inmates. They now have a program where the teachers own the curriculum, and they've expanded from the San Francisco to Los Angeles jail and to several other facilities where they are bringing education to the kids and not just working on a GED, but actually working on a high school diploma. We also have a creative arts elementary school where they are putting a different emphasis on education, on an arts emphasis and all that isn't something that could necessarily be done the same way in the public schools. So these I think are good examples of what charter schools are supposed to be, and they're working well.
And so what were the first charter schools that came in that maybe were not as...
First charter school
that didn't fit this model? First
charter school in San Francisco was Edison. Edison Corporation took over Edison Elementary, and
which our current superintendent of San Francisco schools was a principal of.
Yes, and the main problem with Edison is they were running counter to the schools. They were recruiting students out of the public schools, trying to cream the schools and all that. They were fairly early and fairly crude originally version of what charter schools should are, or the way they've been constructed. While I was president of the union, Jeb Bush put together a conference in San Francisco down at the Palace Hotel, and the purpose of the conference was to talk about the amount of money that is spent in public education and how that can be diverted to business people who could then run the schools more effectively. And Jeb Bush and his organization identified education as a $5 billion business, and they wanted the business. That, I think, is a problem. The schools and education has never been about being a business, does not work on the same principles. And to look at it that way, I think is ultimately very destructive of education.
And so how did the union react? And then the KIP, the proliferation of charters is something that happens, to my understanding, a little bit later in the early 2000s, so kind of right as you're becoming the president.
Late 90s, early 2000s.
Of the union. What was the union's posture on this? Was it easy at that point to identify the threat that these unions face to education in San Francisco?
There's a structural problem that was brought in by the members of the State Board of Education, who were heavily charter folks at that time. And that is a local school board, such as the San Francisco School Board, especially under the leadership of Jill Wins. She was very out front anti-charter schools person, the school board could reject the application for a charter school, and the charter school could then turn around and apply to Sacramento and get it through the state board. So they could get their application to work in San Francisco approved in Sacramento. And with that came a certain amount of funding. There are a number of schools that were considered, went to Sacramento, got their application accepted, got state money, never developed a school. So there's $500,000 or so per school that simply went away. So there are a problem with them.
When did that shift happen? Was that an act of the assembly, or was that how did that come about?
Prior to Jerry Brown becoming governor the second time, during the time that we had Republican administrations.
So basically it fast-tracked the whole, that led to probably a spurt in charters being issued.
That, and then Proposition 36, I believe it was, that said that a school district, if they declared any piece of property surplus, that had to be offered to charter schools as a facility. So that stopped a lot of the way that schools looked at the property that they had, what kind of things they had.
Okay. And so, for example, something like a school like Edison or Mission Preparatory School, which is a new charter school in the Mission District, or New School, which I think is on the Anoa Maxwell site, or it's on some SFUSD property. What type of rent are they paying? Are they paying a reduced?
I really don't know at this point what they're paying, but I'm sure that there is a structure which allows them to have. I don't believe there's any difficulty in them paying the rent. I think that the buildings are essentially theirs to use.
And just last question on this topic, but what are, because charter schools in many ways represent the biggest threat, perhaps the worst side effect of, maybe it's not a side effect, maybe it's one of the main intended effects of charter schools, is that it reduces the number of members and collective bargaining, membership in unions.
Well, actually, I would disagree with you. The worst effect of charter schools is that it reduces and diminishes the local schools, because it takes money away from the local schools. You don't just see that in terms of teachers and members. That's sort of further down the road. You see that in terms of the resources and what can be offered to the students in that community.
Although, of course, a charter school advocate would present a different picture, oftentimes with New Orleans, for example. Oh, New Orleans test scores have gone up. And
they have the right to be wrong.
Yeah. Okay, so let's, with that kind of side tangent out of the way, if we could just get back to our timeline here. We left off the last interview in the 1980s, and there are various decertification battles where the AFT local here in San Francisco lost its collective bargaining in the early 80s to the NEA, San Francisco Teachers Association.
The two bodies are the San Francisco Federation of Teachers, which is the AFT organization, and the San Francisco Classroom Teachers Association, which is the CTA-NEA body.
And can you basically set up the main causes of the creation of UESF in 1989, and so how did that come into being?
Well, there had been two schools of thought throughout the entire time of going back and forth with the collective bargaining contract. The AFT traditionally said we should merge, we should join together. And the CTA leadership said we should merge, you should join us. And so in 1989, the San Francisco AFT again won the collective bargaining rights, and at that point again said we should merge, and because of the economics of the situation that we talked about earlier, The CTA was willing to merge at that time, and so that put the two organizations together. And as I mentioned the last time, there was about a third members of AFT, about a third were members of CTA, and about a third were not members of anything. And so it was a matter of bringing everyone together and then moving forward as a single organization. The organizations were very different at that time. Each organization had a distribution of material about every 2 weeks. In the AFT, we called them pickups. In the CTA, they called them drops. And that the whole matter of the organization was, I always thought, nicely symbolized just by the two different terms between a drop and a pickup. It was a matter then of putting together one system that worked for everybody and bringing everyone together, writing a whole set of bylaws in the Constitution for the organization. So there were people who were then actively involved in doing that. I was part of that, and CTA members were part of that. Larry Howling for the San Francisco Federation of Teachers was the leader in doing that.
So you had, so this is in October of 1989. Can you talk about a little bit about the financial reasons for why the San Francisco Association, why they kind of were compelled to come to the bargaining table and merge after several offers and attempts in the 1980s?
There are only so many slots that the city will recognize as being places where you can have dues deduction. And you could have one for the membership organizations. And during the time that the Classroom Teachers Association had the contract and had control of that slot for deductions, the San Francisco Federation of Teachers continued to collect dues, but used the slot for the credit union. So the San Francisco Federation of Teachers went out and signed up all, at that time, about 1,700 members to be members of the credit union also. So their dues would flow into the credit union and then from the credit union into the union. In 1989, there had been a difficulty with the CTA and their credit union, and they had been severed. So the CTA did not have a credit union that they could operate with in the same way. And so when the San Francisco Federation of Teachers took that dues slot away from them, they only had dues that they could collect by hand. And that, my understanding was, their numbers went from down something around 1,400 down to about 300 people who were then paying dues. Now the CTA could have maintained an organization, but they would have had to pay for that from the state or federal level, and it would become a considerable burden to do that, and it would have violated basically the principles that they had on how they funded their organization. So they were unwilling to do that, and instead what happened was the merger became much more appealing and attractive to people on the CTA side.
Was this type of tactic of using the credit union, was this employed in other areas to cause a merger?
I don't.
Or was this just unique to San Francisco's?
As far as I know, this was unique to San Francisco.
Okay.
And because we did have a credit union that had been set up many years earlier, and it had been used in the strikes throughout the 70s, and the actual origin of it goes back into the 60s. Mm-hmm. So the credit union was there. It didn't have the problem of being really an arm of the union the way that the CTA had that relationship with Provident, and so there was no need to separate them.
Okay. And how many districts now are represented solely by NEA in California? Is it?
Most of them
are represented by
NEA, by CTA within the state.
By both.
CTA is the state organization,
yeah.
NEA the national.
Yeah.
the majority of the school districts in California are represented by CTA, NEA.
And not AFT, CFT?
No.
Okay.
San Francisco and Los Angeles are fairly unique in that they have both organizations, and so a member of UESF in San Francisco is also a member of the California Federation of Teachers and the American Federation of Teachers, also a member of the California Teachers Association and the National Education Association. And in San Francisco, also a member of the FLCIO.
So we get the two magazines every couple months.
Get more literature than you can count.
Filling up. So if statewide, presently.
Hello.
So CFT has fewer members in California than the California Teachers Association.
That's correct.
Okay. Do you know by what degree, more or less, or?
I don't remember those numbers exactly.
Okay. So as the two organizations merge, Joan-Marie Shelley kind of paints this as a pretty amicable coming together of the two organizations. Can you just describe the initial merger, the mechanics of the merger, and sort of how it played out for the first year?
Well, the merger ended up being pretty amicable, and that's largely because Joan-Marie Shelley and Judy Della Monica made it amicable, where they had been on opposite sides of things forever, it seems. When the merger came into play, they saw that it was their responsibility to make it work. And in order to make it work, they were going to have to work together. So Joan led that, and Judy went along with that also, and they tried to make it as much as though there had never been the friction before, and that it was just something that we should get over. I remember that at one point a CFT officer was in the UESF office and was making some fairly derisive comments about the CTA. And we had to stop him and say, look, you may have been able to do that before the merger, but now we are CTA NEA also. So when you're saying that about us. We don't want to hear it here. So that was the attitude that Joan-Marie engendered, and that's the leadership attitude that we went forward with, and it made the merger work.
Was there a faction within the union that was not happy with the merger?
Oh yes, yeah.
And what was their point of view? How would you characterize their point of view?
They felt that being involved in the merger meant that they were going to be weakened as a union. They were not going to be as strong as a union, and that basically they receded from any kind of leadership positions.
Okay. And were they more radical types, or were they more? What was their?
Not necessarily more radical, but they had the ones that I can think of are the people who had been through the strikes, and they had been tested, and they knew what it meant to be a union. They knew what it meant to really work on union principles, and they felt that there were too many other folks coming in who did not have that same background, and that would weaken what was going forward.
Mm-hmm. Let me just adjust this microphone here, just to put it down below. Just make sure it's picking you up. How's this gonna work? Here, we get it right here. Just all right. So. How else would you characterize Joan-Marie's leadership during the early 1990s? What were some of the goals of the union in terms of collective bargaining and local political campaigns and how it interacted with the district leadership at this time?
Joan-Marie came from a traditional union background. Excuse me. Joan-Marie came from a traditional union background through her father and through her upbringing. And so she helped guide the local teachers more into the House of Labor and to bring in an affiliation, the concept of affiliation with all of labor, brought that back into the teaching world.
In terms of the way the union interacted with the Labor Council, or?
Right, to make sure that there was interaction with the Labor Council. It became educational for the rest of the membership who had not experienced that before.
And you're talking about the former NEA representing
right.
teachers who saw themselves as professionals and not as working class union AFL types.
The CTA, up till about 10 years prior to the UESF merger, had not considered themselves to be union and considered themselves to be a professional association. And they had gone through what they called their con in the late 70s, where they did change the whole way that they approached the idea of collective bargaining and the involvement in collective bargaining.
Mm-hmm. And what were some of the contract gains that were made during this time?
Contracts all sort of build on one another to such a degree that I really would have to go back and research them.
Yeah, no problem. Understood. Okay, so in 1997, Joan-Marie Shelley is voted out. Can you describe that election and kind of what, how Kent Mitchell came to power?
Kent Mitchell was the treasurer, and he decided to challenge Joan-Marie, and so a campaign was put together, and a lot of it ended up being very much attacking Joan on personal level and things like that, which I thought was not good and not wise. And but Kent won and became the new president of UESF.
Can you summarize what were some of his campaign goals, and what were some of the things he attacked her on?
Well, again, they were more, I think, they were personal sort of attacks, and because Joan-Marie was so much a lady, she did not fight back against those kinds of things very well.
What were some of his attacks? What did he claim about her?
Well, Joan is old, Joan is feeble, Joan is sick. Didn't you know how sick she is? And it was all made up. And Kent wouldn't necessarily say it, but some of his stand-ins would say that kind of thing and spread that kind of thing as rumor and all that. That was not the high point of the campaign, I don't think. Kent had been the treasurer, and also Kent was very much of an early adopter of computerized education and was very much involved in that. And so that's what he hoped to, I believe, to bring into the union, was a whole sense of the modernity of the cyber world and all of that. So that is a lot of what he was looked to in order to accomplish.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And he takes over in 1997, boom time, in the late 90s, kind of similar to now. There was a teacher shortage, if I remember correctly, in the late 90s. And you have Rojas as leader. How would you characterize Kent's tenure as UESF president? And
Kent was not a very dynamic leader, and I mean, he had good ideas, but just as something that always sort of stuck in people's mind, in 1979 in the strike, Kent wasn't on strike. He wasn't crossing the line. He wasn't going in, but he was working other gigs and all that in order to keep his family afloat, as everybody is concerned in the strike. So there were concerns about that sort of element of his leadership and all that. And as I say, not a particularly dynamic man. And so he was bringing in things through his vice president, Rudy. Rudy really was of the school that believed that you had to constantly educate the membership. And so membership meetings and executive board meetings, all of those tended to be matters of education and become like little mini classrooms.
Mm-hmm. And you feel that it was less effective, or how would you have liked to have seen those meetings go?
Well, I don't think those, for the most part, really addressed the concerns that people were developing at that time. And I was the secretary of the union, even though I had not run with Kent. I had been the secretary of the union, and in many meetings I was in open conflict with Kent. But when we had external challenges and all that, I supported him, and I supported the leadership and was part of the leadership. And that continued up until 2003, and then we had a challenge within the Progressive Leadership Caucus, where the caucus had to decide who was going to be the candidate for president. And I offered myself, Kent offered himself. I made it very clear that if I was not selected by the caucus, I would not carry on. Kent made it very clear that if the caucus didn't select him, he would carry on anyway because he was the president. He felt he had that right. And as a result of that, I was the caucus person, and we ended up having a slate of people who had run together in the past basically separating. And we had to put together a full executive board slate of about 42 people who would run with us. Linda Plack was my vice president, Elaine Merriweather was the treasurer, and Susan Solomon was the secretary. And we ran together, and we won.
So if we could back up, when was the Progressive Leadership Caucus created in UESF, and what was the purpose of having a caucus instead of just, members at large applying for executive positions?
The purpose of a caucus is to try to have some sort of structure where you can run and actually focus on things like internal politics and things like that, so that they aren't just totally thrown out and become sort of amorphous. And so it then becomes the responsibility of a caucus to make sure that you have a full slate of officers, so you cover all the offices when you have an election and things like that. And when Kent defeated Joan-Marie, he then had a 2-year term. He then had a second 2-year term without really having any kind of caucus or organization. He was challenged then by a grassroots organization, caucus, and so at that point the Progressive Leadership organization was put back together in order to support Kent at that point. And so Kent was in that, I was in that, Susan, most of the leadership was in that at that time.
Okay.
You look a little befuddled. You need a clarification?
Oh, what was the name of the other caucus at that time?
We've gone through a number of opposition caucuses over the years, and it eludes me at the moment.
But and then the Progressive Leadership Caucus, what was the first year? So at the beginning of Kent's term, he was part of the Progressive Leadership Caucus, and then it whittled away, and then it sort of came back.
It would have been 2001, I think.
2001. Okay. So.
And again, just to clarify, under Jim Ballard, going back into the 70s, had been the Progressive Action Caucus, the PAC.
Okay.
Under Joan-Marie did not want to run caucuses and didn't want to have that superstructure there. Mm-hmm. And so she didn't use any of that. That then carried through Kent's first and second term. And then for his third term, caucus activity was activated again, and the old Progressive Action Caucus leaders were brought together,
Mm-hmm.
and Ken Trey became the chair of the new Progressive Leadership Caucus, and that was in 2001.
And there are separate meetings, or
Right.
how regular are those caucus meetings?
They were not that regular. They were more as needed.
When elections, close to
Around
elections, things
yeah.
like this. Okay. I guess we could just pick up while we're on this topic. So later on, there's the EDU caucus that's created, which is the kind of the last iteration of these opposition caucuses. And so a lot of these members, it's Educators for a Democratic Union, which I think also has a regional, it's part of a regional caucus organization, if I'm... so they seem to me to be kind of a more radical association, and maybe saying that, you know, their goal is to bring more democracy into the union. What do you take of their, you know, they became the opposition caucus to the PLC.
Mm-hmm.
What do you take of their claims that, you know, there's not enough democracy in the unions, and there's also not a willingness to strike, which I think is their main organizing principle?
When people talked about strike, I used to usually ask the room whenever we had that discussion how many people had ever been on a strike. And invariably, there might be some people who'd been on one strike. A few times people had been on two strikes. And I felt it was sort of ironic that I was being told that I was not willing to lead a strike. I've been through 4 strikes in San Francisco. I've been through every single strike that had occurred in the San Francisco Unified School District. And it's not a romantic thing. And a real strike is not something where you say we're going to be out for 3 days and then we're going to be back. That's a demonstration. A real strike, you say I'm withdrawing my services and I'm not coming back until either I win or I absolutely have to come back. And so I think having that knowledge and having that experience made me look at the matter of organizing around strikes as being a little different than the people who really thought about it without ever having experienced it.
Mm-hmm. So I've been in the district now for about 12 years. I mean, I've probably voted, I would guess 3 times now. Strike vote, 2 or 3 times, I can't remember exactly. So, and it seems to me oftentimes it's kind of like a charade, maybe not like a charade, but it's something we do to put pressure as like a, you know, political pressure. Everyone gets together, kind of rallying the members together. And it's true that the number of teachers who vote in those strike votes is often, you know, half, or if that, maybe that's a good number actually. So it's kind of hard to mobilize the membership. I mean, what is the role of a strike? When should teachers, you know, withhold? Like, what types of issues would you say are kind of the red line for calling a strike?
I think going back to 1979 that we talked a little bit about yesterday, I think that was the absolute classic rationale for why you had to go on strike. Because in 1979, the terms of employment were being changed by the employer. You no longer had tenure or a right to your job. Now, tenure and the right to the job had been established in the 1800s. Kate Kennedy and those early leaders had established that. And to have that unilaterally removed by a school district meant that it was a life or death struggle. That's when you strike. That's when we did strike.
Mm-hmm. And then how about the RedforEd wildcat strikes that are going on? What's your response?
You know, those are
those kind of justified in your?
Those are mostly being organized in the absence of a strong organization in the area, and are the results of frustration that you have when you do not have a strong leadership. I think that they make perfect sense that they're going to come about that way, And my hope was that they would then transition into a strong union movement that would be able to continue. You know, the idea of the foment of the feeling of oppression and all that, that is an organizing principle. But in order to make that effective, you've got to translate that into a union organization.
Which is hard in a state like Arizona,
yeah,
and West Virginia to
and
pull
Oklahoma,
that off. Yeah. Lots of challenges. Okay, and so you come to power. Could you talk a little bit about your election as the president of UESF in 2003, and then do you talk about what do you see as your major achievements during that tenure?
Well, a couple of things that I wanted to do was to start moving politically and start making the union respected by the employer and the other folks in town. And so to that end, we set about creating a political action fund, a political fund. And that then gave us, once you had money, you started to get the attention of politicians, and you got the attention of people who then wanted your support. And so you were able to start that conversation about, you want our support, this is what we want. So, you know, that then is key to me to how a union achieves things without having to always go on strike or always threaten strike. And again, by having political money, we were able to do that. One of the other things we did was we at that time gave half of our dues to the Classroom Teachers Association, but we were getting no services from the Classroom Teachers Association. And so the state CTA looked at San Francisco as an AFT operation, and that to me was absolutely crazy. You're paying for services. You ought to get them. So we asked the regional manager of CTA to come into the office, and we should have that conversation. Well, it turned out that the representative from the CTA for San Francisco did not even know that we had moved our offices from the Church Street area out to North Beach. That had happened in Kent's last year, and the CTA simply hadn't been notified. We were told by CTA leadership that they did not want CTA brought into San Francisco to be embarrassed. We had no intention of doing that. So by demonstrating good faith with the CTA, we were able to bring in CTA resources in terms of training and organizing, and I think that helped us a tremendous amount. So we then formed, we basically made the merger work through the state organizations also. We also worked to try to bring together the state officers so that they were more in contact with one another. I always remembered a particular fundraiser that when the fundraiser was over, 2 CTA officers were standing there waiting for somebody to pick them up. 2 AFT officers were standing there, CFT officers standing there, would not talk, turned their backs to one another. Made no sense to me. You're going to be in San Francisco. We have San Francisco problems that demand the attention of both organizations, and so we worked to bring both organizations together and to make the local organization that much stronger.
Mm-hmm. And so this political fund that's set up, that's a portion. You voluntarily sign up for it, correct? Mm-hmm. I think I have that extra little part. Is it what is it? The CAPE? No, what is it?
COPE.
COPE. That's right. The COPE.
And COPE is a AFT designation, Committee on Political Education, and so you have a voluntary checkoff for that, or for scholarship, or for. There's a third category around public relations.
Okay. And what's an example of some type of political achievement that or benefit that members gained as a result of that setup?
As a result of that, then we were able to play in 2008. As a result of having that kind of checkoff and building up that kind of political fund, we were then able in 2008, when came to try the first parcel tax, we were able to put in $100,000 into that parcel tax, so that you saw the literature that came out said it was funded by UESF, Don Fisher, and I can't remember if a third party was there or not, but it meant that we had money to start steering things to happen politically.
Don Fisher did he give money?
He gave money.
Towards the Prop A?
He did.
Wow, that's surprising.
He gave $100,000. Well, that was through the intervention of Warren Hellman. Warren Hellman, long family association in San Francisco. Their family had been the founders of the Wells Fargo Bank, and Hellman took public education as his
former Goldman Sachs.
Yeah.
And private equity.
Not one of these guys that you think of as going to be your natural ally, but he took public education as his. He took public education to be something that he was very interested in. And so when we talked about the underfunding of the schools and how we needed money, he talked about, fine, let's work to do that. So Proposition A, one thing that it included, Don Fisher, who had been a student at Lowell, at the same time that Hellman had been a student at Lowell, and they had been competitive then. Don Fisher told Hellman that he was going to oppose Proposition A, and Hellman said, what if you got $1 million a year out of it? And Fisher said, what do you mean? Hellman said, well, you have charter schools, also in San Francisco. What if they got $1 million a year from Proposition A? Well, that's a small portion of what Proposition A raises. And Hellman said, if you put in $100,000, you'll get $1 million a year. Can you get a better deal than that anywhere? Fisher went for it. There was no significant opposition. His name was on the posters as supporting it. It helped pass it.
Well, is that a 10,000% annual return? Can't figure out the math on that one. That's a pretty good return.
The UESF return was much larger than that.
Yeah.
Because for our members, for $100,000, we got all of those raises and all of those benefits that have continued every year and go for a 20-year term.
A radical position to that would say, oh well, you're doing business with the devil.
Right.
And there was opposition to the Prop A campaign, right?
There was minimal opposition. There were, we found a couple of lawn signs.
No, from within the union, wasn't there?
Oh yes,
from within the union, there were some people who said,
of course,
it didn't give enough. Can you describe what that?
We had people who said, well, I'll be paying what it was at the start, $130, $150, in order to get my own raise. And yet the raise that they would get would be in the area of around $2,000. And there were teachers who did not understand the benefit of getting $2,000 and expending $150 or so for it. And there were people who said that this is essentially a regressive tax. And it's not perfect in that way. But it's a matter that you had to look at what they talk about, not making the
perfect the enemy of the good.
You got it. Not making the perfect the enemy of the good.
Yeah. Well, I started teaching in 2007. I think I became a permanent member in 2007, and the campaign was in 2008. So it was the fall, I guess, when I became a permanent teacher. So I definitely have probably benefited at this point, 150 to 100,000. It's kept me in San Francisco and in my rent controlled apartment.
The first thing it did is it moved the salaries up to being at that time $50,000 was the base, was the beginning salary.
Yeah.
And I had two young men come to me who were active in politics and say, if I can start off at $50,000, I can afford to be a teacher. And this incredible market. It's so hard for anybody to do anything, but it made a difference between starting there and starting at 35 or 42 or, all of those.
And there has been some, during the downturn, wasn't there some kind of give and take with the Board of Education about how to use those funds? Some of the funds were used.
Essentially,
Can you describe that?
In order to prevent layoffs, what we did is we agreed that instead of being a 20-year tax, it would be a 19-and-a-half-year tax, and they could roll one half of the year into funding the district, and to avoid layoffs. So we got away from layoffs by doing that.
And has the district done anything to kind of take away some of the funding, or how did the implementation of the tax, how did it work? Was there any kind of funny business?
What I think you find, and I'm not involved in it now and haven't been for several years, but I think what you find is that as you go down the years, different funds that are created for different purposes, different managers see them differently and reorient them. The fact is the money is still there. There is an oversight committee. The money is still being spent. Now, not all of it's being spent, and curiously enough, the money that is not being spent tends to be on the district side. The district has a certain amount of money that they have to do their things. They pay administrators out of that. They pay that charter school thing, that $1 million. They have different things that they have to accomplish out of the parcel tax also, and they end up tending to run a surplus where they don't spend all of that. Now that's different from year to year, but
where does that surplus go?
In theory, it goes right back into the fund, and they simply build it up. Now, there's no reason why they should be building that up. That money should be out there, and it should be working.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, one thing that surprised me, I worked fairly actively on the last, I'm blanking on the recent proposition, Prop A.
G.
Prop G, sorry, yeah, Prop G. We just came out of elections, so all my... all my letters are getting
so many school elections are Proposition A. They very often are Proposition A.
So Prop G, of course, I had 2 big Prop G signs in my windows. The support fell by about 10%. What do you? And it was in a similar type of election. Maybe the one difference is that there was a mayoral election going on too. So perhaps the turnout, my guess would be maybe a little bit bigger than the 2008 election. Why do you think the support has fallen for teachers? So Prop G passed, but it passed at 59% as opposed to, I think, 69%. What do you think attributes?
For one thing, when Proposition A was done, you had to pass it 66 2/3%. And when Proposition G came along, the laws had been changed, the rules had been changed, so you only had to pass it 55%. And so it created a different dynamic in terms of what you really had to aim for. I think that more than anything. The San Francisco citizens have been incredibly supportive of the schools and have done this kind of thing. This particular tax is a result of many, many propositions that had been created to build schools, and they were invariably Proposition A's.
Mostly bonds. Right?
Mostly bonds. Yeah. And under Arlene Ackerman, when we were asked to support Proposition A, we finally said, what's in it for us? What's in it for the teachers? What's in it for our members, for the paraprofessionals? And we had commitment from certain board members that the next one will be for you. So we took that up. We also, in negotiations back in 2004 or 5, the district said there was no way that they could do any more salary than what they had on the table unless there had been an election to create more money. So we wrote that into the contract. And we activated that from the contract to create the committee that created the 2008 Proposition A.
So who was on that committee? Can you describe that?
On that committee, there were 5 members on our side, and it was Armin Sadrakian, who is currently a principal over at Lawton.
Yeah, my wife is the social worker there and works with Armin.
So Armin was absolutely wonderful because he's a very good math person and all that. Carolyn Samoa. Carolyn's one purpose was to sit there and say, and what about the Paris? And what about the Paris? And so she did that through the negotiations.
Armin's a lawyer as well, by the way.
Is he? Good. My sister knows Armin because he also does a monthly write-up of Armenian activities in the Bay Area. And so my sister had always thought that Armin was some little old man sitting someplace with a quill. I said, no, you know. Anyway, Ken Trey was on the committee. Linda Plack was on the committee, and I was. So there was just the five of us.
And it's kind of a question of, you want to find that right spot because you obviously don't. I mean, what would have stopped you guys from making it like a $300 or $400 tax? Meaning, did you have to kind of figure out what politically would be kind of viable?
You had to figure out what in your estimation was politically viable. The district wanted to keep it as low as possible. We wanted it 3 times as high, you know. But you had to find a number that you thought would work, that was a defensible number, and a number that you could rally people around. And so, you know, we came up with the number that we originally came up with. Now, there is an escalator in it that whatever the consumer price index for urban areas is, if that goes up, then the tax goes up. And so that's raised it over the years.
Or if new parcels are created. So, for example, in the Mission Bay.
And new parcels are created, they don't go any higher, they're simply included.
Yeah.
And one of the things that helped us is the government decided that if you had an apartment house and a separate garage, that constituted 2 parcels. So we don't know how you're going to lose parcels unless they fall into the bay. But that allowed us to have even more parcels and to develop more money.
Mm-hmm. And then with, you know, so Prop A, it had a 20-year term. When Prop G passed, did Prop G in any way affect the Prop A money, or will that come up? When will the Prop A issue come up again? Because
Prop A,
for teachers, it's not part of...
Prop A starting in 2008 goes for 20 years, so it's 2028 that'll have to be renewed in some way.
Uh-huh. So we'll have to get back to the ballot.
Right. And I think that it would have been better to have tied Prop G into that and let Prop G extend Prop A also. But instead, they're going to be 2 separate things that move forward.
Mm-hmm. And then is the Prop G money, is that part of the STRS salary? So when you go to retire...
Your rule of thumb on STRS is that if it's available for everybody, it goes into your STRS account. If you have to do something special in order to get it, then it goes into your STRS supplementary account, which is like a 403B.
Yeah.
So money that you earn, that everybody can earn, goes through Prop A or Prop G. That goes onto your STRS account.
Mm-hmm. All right. And are there any other... so Prop A is kind of obviously one of the big achievements that, you know, the union accomplished during your presidency. Are there any other things you'd like to point out?
Well, I think you have to go back and appreciate the whole matter of really creating a real merger between CTA and CFT in terms of support of the local. That made a lot of difference also, I think, in terms of the way we were able to move, because that also, beyond the $100,000 UESF put into a campaign like Prop A, you also were able to call on CTA for money and CFT for money, on NEA for money and on AFT. Now, AFT and NEA don't get too involved in all of that, but CTA is very much a big dog in state politics, so it was very important that CTA feel totally involved in San Francisco and supportive of San Francisco, not feel that it was a separate AFT local.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And any other political, you know, things that the UESF was involved in during this time? It's always, I guess, you know, among the union when we make a political endorsement, you know, we have a diverse membership. So if you pick, you know, candidate A, people who support candidate B are not going to be happy about that. So for example, we endorsed Ed Lee.
No.
I think it was maybe the second time when he ran on. The
second time.
Yeah. Maybe you could talk
because you can endorse 3 people for, you know, first, second, third choice. The second time we had only endorsed for first and second, and there was a possibility that Ed Lee would have been endorsed for third. And instead of appearing before UESF or even sending a reasonable staff person, he sent an intern of some sort to plead for him, and it just turned everybody off, and people would not support Ed Lee. Mm-hmm. Actually, the third person that year, I think, was Leland Yee.
Uh-huh.
Now, Ed Lee never seemed to hold that against us.
Uh-huh.
He was very gracious and continued with the whole Teacher of the Year program and all that out at Candlestick, and under his direction with Hydra Mendoza as his person, helped to expand that. They then brought in Administrators of the Year, and I think the last year or so they've also done Paraprofessionals finally, after we had begged them to do that for a while.
Mm-hmm.
I think I talked to you about that the last time.
So another, as I said, I've been in union for about 12 years now, and pretty much every year from, I'd say 2007 until about 11 or 12 maybe they stopped, we would get layoff notices. Can you talk about how you navigated the Great Recession?
Well, I indicated to you the one thing that when it really came down to crunch time, Carlos
Garcia?
Yeah, Carlos Garcia was superintendent at that time, and so the agreement was made basically to give up a half year of Proposition A money in order to dedicate that money into filling the need and to avoid layoffs. The other thing that helped us was we had allied ourselves with Tom Amiano. Tom, of course, had been a teacher, school board member on the Board of Supervisors, and he created a rainy day fund. Now, the reason you kept getting layoff notices was because of a defect in the rainy day fund that ended up being fixed later. The rainy day fund could only be accessed by the school district. The rainy day fund is city money. Could only be accessed by the school district if there were layoffs. So that what Myung Lee and the school district would do was they'd see what the shortfall is, they would issue layoffs, they would apply for the rainy day fund, which would then mean you didn't have to have layoffs and everything would be all right. So there were several years where we had to go through an absolute charade of issuing layoffs. Incredibly destructive to the individuals who got the letter.
Yeah, many of the people believed the letters.
Sure, they believed the letters and they'd bail out. And, there was virtually no way that we could change that process until we could change. There was virtually no way we could change that process until we could change the basis where you had to show first layoff. So now you just have to show financial need. So it's a different approach.
Mm-hmm. So if there were another recession and a budget shortfall that was on a similar scale, what you're saying is that there are apparatuses now in place to prevent that type?
You don't have to issue layoffs in order to access the rainy day fund money.
The question is whether the rainy day fund is there.
Yeah, well, that's written into city charter now.
Yeah. So could you talk a little bit about, and Anything else that you'd like to mention about your time as president, or can you describe how it came to an end? How you left in, was it 2015? 15, okay.
I lost an election. You know, that happens. You know, I think that you know, Lita, I think, was not really prepared to be president, and I think that she got out after one term, and I think wisely so. I think Susan Solomon is well prepared to be president, and I think that she will be a very effective president. You know, it's a matter of what you know about what you need to do that helps determine how successful you're going to be as a president, and it becomes a pretty much of a consuming job.
Mm-hmm. So how do you think, if you feel a leader wasn't prepared, how do you think she was able to win an election, a leadership election?
I mean, the one thing that a person who had been in the position as an incumbent, the one mistake we usually make is you get too involved in the job and you don't get out into the schools enough. And I know that that's true. That is absolutely true. I was in the schools a lot less because I was now on all kinds of committees and things like that, which meant that that's where my time was going. So you then create a separation from the membership. They don't know what you're doing in all those god-awful committees. I can't tell you how many meetings we had around educator housing and all that, as we had to play with the district all the time, until really Ed Lee stepped in and said, damn it, you're going to have educator housing. Because the school district kept chanting their little mantra, we don't want to be anybody's landlord. And so we would have meetings where we would bring in resources and we'd show them how it could be done. Now, it's working for the benefit of the membership, but they don't see that. They don't see that. If they don't see you in the schools and they don't see you actually involved in their lives at the level where they are working, they don't know what you're doing. So
yeah, if we could come back to that housing issue, and there is a specific plan. If we could come back to the house, there's two different sites that come to mind. One is near the ballpark, and the other is the old was it the principal's building that might be turned into. We could talk about that in a sec, but so because I definitely get that sense a lot from people who don't really know what the union is. They don't really know the structure, and I myself kind of fall into that category. For just how the union works. It's definitely, you can see how people come to think of the union as the leadership rather than really what the union is you. You are a member in the union. You are the union. What are some mechanisms, and real ones, not just kind of like platitudes, like what are some real ways we could democratize the union? Because I think a lot of people feel that sense of disconnection and alienation, which can be very harmful, and it can lead good people to reject unions altogether.
Sure.
What are some things that the leadership, people who get entrenched in power, whether it was you, it's going to Susan now, it's Lita was Lita, it's what can they do to make the union more democratic and bring members involved?
Well, it sounds bureaucratic, but what you have to do, I think, is you have to change some of the structures of the union. And so during my time, what we tried to do is we tried to bring in people by grade level also, school-based leaders by grade level. So if you look at a union calendar, you see that the Wednesdays are allocated for an executive board meeting, an assembly meeting, and then we created meetings of the divisions, the grade levels. And they weren't anywhere near as successful as we had hoped they would be, because we were looking for another way for people to come in and enter into the work of the union at a different level. So they do the fourth Wednesday they do as a sort of like a training meeting now for different things and all that. So that structure is what we tried to do in order to democratize what was going on more. It becomes difficult to know exactly, because each school site will have different problems and different concerns. So whether you want them to act as like little individual Soviets and have their own responsibilities at each school, or if you want to have them come together, it's a different way of approaching it. I think you have a lot more power by bringing things together, but that means that you're relying on somebody at the school site to be a good building rep. So we built into the contract some things where you could actually release building reps for part of their day, but very few people pick it up and use it. I think that kind of thing, so that you develop more of an active union leadership at the site, so that there's a site-based leadership. In the 60s, 70s, I think there was a feeling of mission about the union where we would pick it up and we would do that at the school sites. There's not that sense of mission at this time. So you have to then create that same sort of thing differently. I'm not in a position right now to do that kind of thing, but I think it's going back into the buildings and getting the activity and getting the leadership active at the building level.
Mm-hmm. Which is a tough thing to do. Yeah, because we're very, teachers are taxed, and it's hard. Just seeing Prop G, which is an example when, if you're not going to come out for something like Prop A or Prop G, you're never going to be motivated. It's essentially, it's a ballot measure to give you a raise. Mm-hmm. And I definitely saw a lot of, a lot of teachers are just not willing to come out. It's a very small percentage of the membership.
Teaching is a very isolating profession. I mean, you go into your classroom with your kids, and you may have responsibilities to do some things that you're told have to be done curricularly, but basically it's you and the kids in there. And that, I think, works against unionization of the members, because you don't necessarily get in touch with other people. There used to be schools where there was something different going on in the faculty lounge. There were schools where they played bridge. There were schools where they did this, and they did that. And there are all these different sort of levels of participation. Well, society's changed quite a bit, and you don't see that same sort of involvement of people at the school site and with one another as much as you did in the way back times that I was just citing. So people are not brought together. So it's harder to then create unity around a union purpose or a union issue.
Yeah, faculty rooms, for example, at Lincoln High School does not have a faculty lunchroom. They did near the cafeteria. So even teachers who are not much older than me, who've been at Lincoln for maybe 20 years, 15, 20 years, they say, hey, it was common for teachers to eat together. Or at least not everyone did, but you knew during lunch, if you wanted to, you could go down to the faculty lounge, and sometimes you'd avoid it to avoid certain people and conversations. But the fact that it was there did create a sense of camaraderie. I mean, one thing I think that's really important is education. And Fred Glass said, he tried to push it all the way up to the AFT level. And I don't know who was before Randy Weingarten. But he said he basically took it up to the president, and he said, okay, I totally support it. Or he said something about, education, it's every union member's or leadership executive's second favorite issue, or something like that. Like, everyone will pay lip service to it, but they won't really support it with real gusto. So, for example, in the district, I think what would be great is to have some kind of introductory video. All new members, when they come in, they watch a video. Hopefully it's humorous, and it shows, okay, this is Susan Solomon, somebody walking around the union headquarters. This is Julian Corona is the high school division rep, and then give a little bit of history behind the union, and just let people know what it is. Tell them about assemblies, tell them about the meeting structure that you were talking about before. So that's, I think, something that the leadership can do, and also just to show their faces. Who are these people? that run your union?
At least in my days, we turned out staff, and we did that for every new teacher meeting. We didn't have a movie; we had a presentation, and it became painful to follow Carranza because Carranza used to use a real dopey little story about how a teacher had cared for a child and followed a child through. I mean, it was a made-up internet sort of story, but he would use that all the time, and I would.
Call from.
Anyway, Carranza would use this little made-up story in order to show how a teacher, by caring, would have this student following him, for all the way through, and the student went on to become a doctor or something like that. But it was completely a phony story, and you'd be there and you'd say, this is absolute garbage. Now you've got to talk to people seriously and take them seriously when you're following up this truckload of just absolute bull. But so it became difficult to work some of those meetings. But we always brought full staff out there and always had officers there to make that. But when you talk about the little introductory movie, I just wonder how much the 5-7 minute movie, how many people would just be falling asleep, or how much of a dent it would make on anybody.
Well, if you just to make it humorous, I mean, I look at there was a great movie that I think it's called Hellbent on Education. It was made, I think it was made in the early '60s after the HUAC, attack, which basically destroyed the Los Angeles AFT local, and it split, and then basically the more radical one kind of went into ether. But they got together and made a funny video about it was the worst man in the world or something. But it was satire, and it was very entertaining, very apropos for the present day, just attacking tenure, underfunding in education, all these themes in American history that are still in the present day. But it was humorous and it was educational, and I think there's a place for good. It's called propaganda, for our side, for education, prop edu, or agitprop, whatever.
Yeah, in the ancient old days, the school district used to call the teachers together at the beginning of the year, and you always had sort of some access to all of the teachers there. But even when I mentioned that, you rolled your eyes because people don't want to be there. The beginning of the year, they want to do the things they need to do in order to get ready. Yeah. And so it's really hard to find a time where you can get an audience and have them there for you. That's why I tend to lean more on the concept of building level leadership and the idea that you have to work on what it takes in order to get people actually, a leader active within the building. And it's going to probably come down to try to make some sort of contractual changes where the union picks up the responsibility for some portion of their day or something like that.
Yeah. Well, we've got a great leadership at Lincoln High School right now. Very young set of politically active, non-white male leadership. So there's definitely changes that's happening in the membership. Last little couple pieces before we've got to end this conversation. Your involvement at the AFT level after 2015. Can you describe being a vice president of the AFT and what that
I was vice president of the AFT from about 2005 through 2016. I guess that was the end of my term. And so that meant you were called together, I think, 3 or 4 times a year in order to consider policy and all that for the national union and how it should affect the local. By being in that position, the organization that we now know as Close the Gap, we were able to bring things like that and resources from AFT into San Francisco in order to do that kind of thing, and we were able to participate in some of the other initiatives that came out of other locals because we knew about them through being involved in the AFT vice presidents and the executive council.
Mm-hmm. And you took a couple trips. You went to Ireland and Israel. Can you describe?
The AFT does some of those trips from time to time, and so a lot of the vice presidents are involved in them. I was involved in going to Israel with a study group and all that, and met teachers from the Palestine Teachers Organization, whom I subsequently met at the World Teachers Organizations and things like that. So it was very good for that. Then when I went to Ireland, there happened to be a confluence of two of the three Irish teacher unions were meeting during the same week. So I was able to go to two of them, see what they were doing, report back. And there were allegiances or alliances made with different leaders there, whom I would then see at the AFT conventions, and I would be responsible for them, taking care of them and guiding and directing them when I saw them.
Nice. So international work. And then the Ben Rust Award, you were given an award.
Ben Rust was a teacher in Richmond who is considered to be the sort of the refounder of the California Federation of Teachers. And since 1975, an award